everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie. I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from Florida when a young mother of two was found brutally murdered in her own home one morning in the early 80s. Police sprung into action to try and work out who had done this to her, who had committed such an evil and violent crime, and in the very beginning they weren't short on suspects. They looked heavily at the people closest to the victim, even her own teenage children, as possibly being the killer. However, years would pass by and tragically the case went cold. Decades passed even, with no arrests made and no answers, no justice. But then, more than 38 years after the crime, and police had a breakthrough when new DNA techniques finally gave them an indication as to who the murderer was. And to say that everyone was shocked when they discovered his identity would be an understatement. This individual was someone who was pretty close to home, someone that the victim's own sons trusted, someone that they looked up to, and yet they had no idea for nearly 4 whole decades that he was a cold-blooded killer who had taken their mother away from them. Join me as we delve into the chilling case of Linda Slayton. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to June's Journey for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. June's Journey is a hidden object mystery game set in the gorgeous glamour of the 1920s with a diverse cast of characters where you get to play detective. You play as June Parker, a smart and independent woman who is trying to solve the murder of her own sister Claire and brother-in-law Harry, and along the way you'll be uncovering the many secrets within June's family. As you progress through the game, you'll collect different clues, each of which will help to bring you one step closer to solving the mystery. You'll also get to start fixing up and renovating the Parker family's very old and rundown mansion and the garden surrounding it, and as well as the mystery element, you'll also explore other themes and topics such as love, betrayal, family relationships, motherhood, social injustice, and even more. June's Journey have actually just released a brand new captivating trailer which you can watch on their social channels, or I will link it in the description box, and they have set a little challenge just for you guys, my subscribers, which involves this hidden object scene from the game. You've got to try and find one of the crucial clues which is hidden in plain sight by solving the following riddle. If J equals 10 and P equals 16, what does 6, 15, 15, 20, 16, 18, 9, 14 and 20 mean? Drop a comment down below if you are able to solve the riddle, but if not, I will be revealing the hidden object at the end of the video, so stay tuned. June's Journey is just such an engaging and captivating mobile game. The story is constantly evolving and there are new chapters every single week. It's literally perfect for true crime enthusiasts like us, so if you would like to check it out for yourself, then you can download the game for free by clicking the link at the top line of the description box or scanning the QR code that is on the screen right now. June's Journey is available to download on both iOS and Android mobile devices as well as on PC. Thank you so much once again to June's Journey for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, as well as domestic abuse, domestic violence and racism. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 44 years now to September of 1981 in the city of Lakeland, which is located in Polk County in the state of Florida in the US. And this is Linda Slayton. She was a 31-year-old woman who lived in Lakeland with her family. Formerly Linda Joyce Patterson, she was born on the 8th of March 1950. According to sources, her father was named Forrest, her mother was named Margaret, and I believe Linda was just one of 2 children. She had a sister named Judy. I couldn't really find any information online about Linda's childhood, so I can't really comment on what that was like for her, but by the time this case occurred, by the time she was just 31 years old, she was a mother of 2 teenage boys actually. Linda was a very young mum. When she was only around 14-15 years old, she fell pregnant with her first child. The baby's father was a man named Frank Slayton, and he was about 7 years years older than Linda. I think he was in his early 20s when she became pregnant. But the two eventually married, making Linda Patterson Linda Slayton, and Linda gave birth to their son, their firstborn, who they named Jeff Slayton. And then just a couple of years later, Linda and Frank had a second child, another little boy who they named Tim. He was about 3 years younger than his little brother. And Tim seemed to complete the Slayton family, complete this family of 4, and they settled down in Alabama, I believe. However, Jeff and Tim's home life was a very, very difficult one, to be honest. They grew up in a very volatile household due to their father Frank's alcohol addiction and violence. Frank Slayton was an alcoholic. He would drink to excess, and when he did this, he would be incredibly abusive towards his family, I think mainly towards his wife Linda. He was just described as being a very mean man, to be honest. The more that he would drink, the more aggressive he became, and yeah, he was very physically abusive towards Linda throughout their marriage, which tragically her sons had to witness. There were constant arguments and fights between them, and Jeff and Tim recalled in a documentary that I watched about this case how on one occasion when their father Frank came home from work, he was already very intoxicated, and as soon as he walked into the house, he just suddenly pulled out a gun and he held it to Linda's head. He was threatening to shoot her, and of course the brothers immediately panicked. Jeff jumped up, he lunged over to his father and tried to grab the gun from his hand, but his father just grabbed him and kicked him out of the room, locked him out. Thankfully, Frank did not shoot Linda. She did survive that attack, but I mean, can you imagine the trauma that this event must have left not just her with, but also her 2 boys? They were so young when this happened. Jeff was only about 6-7 years old and Tim was just 3. And to witness their father pull a gun on their mother, it must have been so terrifying for them. Linda knew the danger that she was in this marriage, the danger that her children were in, and so eventually in 1974, when Linda was only around 24 years old, after about 9 years of marriage to Frank, she took her 2 sons and she fled. She left Alabama and she relocated to Lakeland in Florida with her 2 boys. I believe they moved in with Linda's parents for a while as they lived on this big farm, which the boys just loved. They had so much fun living on this farm. And I believe they lived there until eventually Linda, Jeff and Tim moved into their own apartment within an apartment complex on North Brunel Parkway in Lakeland. They moved into this ground floor apartment not long before this case occurred, actually. So yeah, Linda was now a single mother working hard to make ends meet, and it was a struggle for her, of course, a struggle for her financially to be able to provide for her 2 children on her own. But she got a job and she would do things like make her own clothes to save money. She actually sold her car so that she could bring in some money, meaning that she had to walk to work every day. She worked so incredibly hard just to get by every month and to give her 2 boys the best life that she possibly could in Florida. It's clear that Linda was just an amazing mum to Jeff and Tim. They recalled how their mother was always very outgoing and fun-loving. They have good memories of their mum taking them to the beach and going for picnics, just the 3 of them. They seemed to build a really good life for themselves in Florida over the years. It was a fresh start for all 3 of them, away from the abuse that they experienced in the past, and they seemed happy. They had their ups and downs, as all families do, but overall they seemed to be content in Florida. By 1981, life for Linda and her 2 boys was good, or at least that was until the fall of 1981, when life for the Slayton family changed forever as the result of a vicious and shocking crime which Linda was the victim of. It was the 4th of September 1981, and that morning Linda had plans to meet with her sister Judy for coffee. Well, Judy was going to go to Linda's house for a coffee. Judy only actually lived literally a couple of doors down from her sister. She lived in the same complex, and they would regularly go to each other's houses for a cuppa and a catch-up pretty much every single day, and yeah, that was the exact plan that morning. At around 8:30 a.m, Judy walked to her sister's apartment. She knocked on the front door, however, there was no answer. Linda never opened the door. Doesn't seem as though Judy really thought much of this at the time. Perhaps she assumed that her sister must have still been asleep or something, and so she turned around and decided to just walk back home, back to her apartment. However, before she did so, something caught her eye. She glanced over to one of the windows of Linda's apartment and she noticed that the window screen was missing and the window was wide open. This was the window to Linda's bedroom. So Judy walked up to this window, she peered inside, outside and she saw her sister Linda lying on her bed, and she thought to herself, oh okay, yeah, Linda is still sleeping, or at least that's what she believed initially. As Judy looked closer, to her absolute horror, she quickly realized that Linda was not sleeping, she was dead. She wasn't lying like a person would normally lie on their bed. Linda was lying diagonally across the bed with her feet hanging off of the edge, and around her neck, Judy could see what looked like a coat hanger. Linda had a wire coat hanger secured tightly around her neck. It had been bent around her neck. So in a state of absolute shock, Judy just immediately started screaming, which alerted a maintenance man who was working nearby, and the emergency services were called. So police officers with the Lakeland Police Department were quickly dispatched to the scene, and to their shock, when they arrived and they made their way inside of Linda's apartment, they actually realized that Linda's two sons, Jeff and Tim, who were 15 and 12 by this point in 1981, they were in the house. They were still sleeping when officers arrived. It appeared as though they had slept through whatever had happened to their mother. They were in the house when their mother died, and they just had no idea. So when officers went into the house, they woke the brothers up and they told them to go outside immediately. And what's awful, absolutely awful, is that when 12-year-old Tim was awoken and he started walking through the house towards the front door, as he walked past his mother's bedroom, her bedroom door suddenly opened and a police officer walked out of it. And when Tim glanced inside, he saw what no child should ever have to see. He saw his mum's lifeless body on her bed. Tim saw the crime scene. Of course, this was a murder. The Lakeland police were able to establish pretty quickly that they had a homicide investigation on their hands. Linda Slayton had been killed in her own home, and in such a brutal, brutal way. So as I said, Linda was lying across the bed. She was kind of partially clothed. She was wearing a dress, but it was kind of bunched up above her waist. So her bottom half was exposed and she wasn't wearing any underwear. In fact, the underwear that she had been wearing was just on the floor in her bedroom alongside her flip-flops. The way that her body had been left indicated that she had most likely been sexually assaulted, and this was later confirmed when her autopsy was confirmed. Linda had been raped by her killer, and it seemed pretty clear that her cause of death was strangulation. Strangulation as a result of that wire coat hanger around her neck, which again was later confirmed during autopsy. This coat hanger, Linda's own coat hanger from her closet, was the murder weapon. And in fact, when the police arrived at the scene, they could see from these deep scratch marks to Linda's neck where she had tried so desperately hard to claw this coat hanger away from her neck while she was being strangled. I mean, it's horrific to think about the sheer terror that Linda experienced that night at the hands of her killer. This was such a gruesome and shocking crime. As police continued looking around the scene, around Linda's bedroom, they noticed muddy shoe prints on the floor. There was a shoe print on one of Linda's pillows, and it was believed that these had come from the killer, from where he had come in through the bedroom window and had mud on his shoes. That was his point of entry. He forced his way into Linda's house through her unlocked bedroom window, hence why the window screen had been removed. And luckily, when fingerprint expert Detective Edgar Pickett arrived at the scene that morning, he was able to find and lift a partial palm print from the windowsill, believed to have come from the killer when he forced his way in. So whilst police were collecting evidence from the scene, a homicide investigation was obviously quickly launched, and detectives began trying to piece this crime together. And in an effort to do so, they needed to work out a timeline here, establish Linda's movements the evening before she was found dead. So the evening before the crime, the evening of the 3rd of September 1981, Linda had been at home on her own, and when her eldest son, 15-year-old Jeff, returned, an argument actually broke out between them. Apparently, this was a fairly regular occurrence, to be honest. You know, Jeff was a teenage boy, a typical teenager who seemed to be going through a bit of a rebellious phase, would often get quite moody and a bit mouthy, and so, yeah, in the lead up to his mother's death, they had argued quite a bit about different things, but they would always make up eventually. But yeah, anyway, the night before her death, Linda and Jeff had argued once again. Apparently this argument was about the fact that there was barely any food in the house. Jeff returned home and he was hungry, but there was nothing for him to eat, and so he had a bit of a strop and he left his home, got on his his bicycle and he headed to his grandparents' house, which was just over 10 miles away, and he had some food there. As for his brother, 12-year-old Tim, he had been to football practice that evening. He was part of a local football team, and when practice ended, he was dropped back home by his football coach at around 8:30 p.m. Obviously, Linda didn't have a car anymore, she had sold it, so Tim kind of relied on his football coach, Joe, to give him a ride back home. And then once Tim was home, he and Linda headed to a neighbour's house because apparently this neighbour was having a party that night, a bit of a get-together. So they popped to their neighbours, they spent the evening just chatting and playing card games. Tim recalled how there was even one woman there who was kind of a palm reader. She was going around reading people's palms, and apparently when she read Linda's palm, she looked up at her and said something along the lines of, "Oh, you're gonna live a very short life," which, I mean, is incredibly eerie, isn't it, considering that just the following morning Linda would be found dead at just 31 years old. Linda and Tim spent, I think, a few hours at this party before they returned home to their apartment at around 11 p.m, by which point Linda's eldest son, Jeff, was already back. He'd returned from his grandparents. When Linda got home, she and Jeff chatted about the argument that they had earlier that evening, and they made up as they always did. And soon after this, the two boys, Jeff and Tim, went to bed, and Jeff recalled how the last time that he saw his mum, she had just finished doing the washing up in the kitchen and she was about to go to bed herself, and that was when Jeff said to her, quote, "I love you, mum, I'll see you tomorrow." But of course he was none the wiser that he would never see his mum alive again. That was to be the last conversation that he would ever have with her. Like I mentioned before, Jeff and Tim slept through their mother's murder. Despite the fact that they were in the house, they didn't see or hear anything, which has been so hard for them to come to terms with, to cope with over the years. They felt so much guilt for the fact that they didn't hear the attack and therefore couldn't try to save their mum. Although it wasn't long before the police started to suspect the brothers, actually. Well, specifically, they started to suspect the oldest brother, 15-year-old Jeff. Detectives began to wonder if maybe he was responsible for his own mother's murder. I mean, like I just mentioned, Jeff and his mum Linda would often have arguments. Is it possible that they had yet another one that night after Linda returned home from the neighbour's house and this argument ended in him killing her? Jeff was practically interrogated by the police right in the beginning of this investigation. He was trying to come to terms with the sudden horrific death of his mother, and he was almost being treated like a person of interest. Apparently one police officer even said to Jeff something along the lines of, "You're a big guy, you're strong, you've got big arms, you could have done this, you could have killed your mum." Of course, Jeff denied it. He was adamant that he never would have done this to his mother, but still the detectives had their doubts, and so he was questioned a hell of a lot. They asked him to do a polygraph test twice. I believe the results of the first one were inconclusive, but the second one he passed. They even wanted him to undergo hypnosis, but ultimately their search for evidence linking Jeff to the crime yielded no results. They couldn't find anything to indicate that he was the perpetrator, and so he was soon pretty much ruled out. They realised that he was innocent, but I cannot imagine how awful that must have been for him. Again, like I said, he was already trying to deal with the shock and utter devastation of losing his mum in such a horrendous way. To have to come to terms with that and then also deal with the fact that there were people who thought that you did it, that you were capable of such an evil crime. I cannot imagine how heartbreaking that must have been for Jeff. But Jeff wasn't the only member of the family who was looked at. Understandably, Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, was very much considered a top suspect in the case. I mean, we know how awfully he treated Linda, the abuse that she was subjected to at his hands during their 9-year marriage, the fact that she had to flee to Florida with her 2 kids to get away from him. Does that mean that he could have had a motive? Did he decide to murder his ex-wife as revenge almost for taking his 2 sons away from him? So detectives got in touch with Frank and they asked him what he had been doing on the night that his ex-wife Linda was killed, and he claimed that he was just at home that night. I think Frank was still living in Alabama at this time, and yeah, he said that he was just at home with his wife, his new wife, and he was in all night, which his wife did confirm. She said, yeah, Frank was home all night, but of course that wasn't the strongest alibi for the police because, I mean, there was every chance that his new wife could have been lying for him. But also, again, the detectives couldn't find any evidence to link him to the murder. So Frank Slayton wasn't like fully eliminated as a suspect, I don't believe, but also the police were forced to move on and look at other people in Linda's life. According to one documentary that I watched about this case, Linda had started seeing someone else by the time her murder occurred. She had a new boyfriend. I don't know what his name was, but he too was looked at. However, once again, nothing to connect him to the crime. And he also had a rock solid alibi, so he was ruled out. They just couldn't link anyone to the crime, it seemed. Of course, back then in 1981, authorities were very limited in terms of DNA technology and forensic science. It wasn't really a thing yet, or at least it was in its very, very early days, so they didn't really have that at their disposal. They did have evidence which they'd taken from Linda's body. They'd taken fingernail scrapings and swabs, and, you know, they did the rape kit, so they had the killer's semen, but nothing could be done with this evidence at the time, and unfortunately that meant that the Linda Slayton homicide case started to go cold. Weeks without answers turned into months, and months turned into years, and there was nothing really, no developments in the case. The police had nothing to go on. But Linda's sons, Jeff and Tim, tried to move on with their lives as best they could. They went and lived with their grandparents following their mother's murder, and eventually they went back to school, went back to playing football, and Tim said that everyone was really good, really kind and supportive. His teammates were supportive, his football coach Joe was supportive, and he would help Tim wherever he could, continuing to pick him up for football practice and taking him back home. Jeff and Tim tried to get back into a routine, tried to get back to normal life, but I mean, how can you ever fully go back to your life after going through such tragedy and trauma at such a young age? Jeff says that the day their mother was murdered was the day their childhoods were stolen from them, the day their innocence was stolen, because not only were they so heartbroken, but also as a family they were terrified all the time. Every day that passed by without the killer having been found, they lived in fear that the monster, as they called the perpetrator, would come after them. In fact, Jeff and Tim's grandfather barely ever slept after his daughter was murdered. Whilst his family would be sleeping, he would almost stay on guard with a gun all night because he was so scared of anyone else in his family becoming a victim of the monster. As the years passed by, the police did have other occasional suspects that they looked into, even serial killers, but again, there was never any solid evidence to make an arrest, meaning that the case remained unsolved. Around the late 90s, there was renewed hope in the case when the samples and swabs taken from Linda's body back in 1981 were sent off for testing. Because obviously by this point there had been a lot of advancements in forensic science, so police hoped that they could use these to bring them a step closer to finding the killer. And luckily they did. When the semen was sent off to the lab, scientists were able to obtain a full DNA profile of the killer from it, which was a huge breakthrough in the investigation because they could use this to test against any previous suspects in search for a match. By the 20th anniversary of Linda's death, by 2001, a new detective with the Lakeland Police Department was leading the investigation into Linda's murder, Detective Brad Grice, who funnily enough was actually good friends with Linda's eldest son, Jeff. They were both a part of the same bowling club, I think, and they had been for years. Detective Grice collected DNA samples from the people that had previously been looked at as suspects in the case, including Linda's ex-husband Frank, even samples from her two sons, Jeff and Tim, as well as samples from other men too, but none of them matched the DNA of the killer, so police were able to rule all of these people out once and for all. And he also entered the killer's DNA profile onto the National DNA Database in search for a match, but unfortunately there wasn't one. The perpetrator's DNA was not on there, and tragically it was following this when the case started to go cold once again. Yes, obtaining this DNA profile was a huge breakthrough, but without that match, police were still powerless. Police couldn't do anything. They still had no idea who the perpetrator was. And then in 2015, more than 3.5 decades after after the crime, the lead detective, Detective Brad Grice, retired from the police department. He didn't want to. He really didn't want to. He'd actually made a promise to his good friend Jeff Slayton that he wouldn't retire until he had solved this case and found his mother's killer. But by 2015, he was apparently having some health and medical issues, and so he kind of had no option but to rest and retire, which was gutting for him, truly gutting that he couldn't keep his promise to the Slayton brothers. And it was then when Jeff and Tim started to kind of face the very real possibility that, you know, this case might never be solved. That they themselves might pass away, never knowing who had done this to their poor mum all those years ago and why. They really started to lose hope, I think. But the Lakeland Police Department weren't willing to just give up on the case. A couple of years after this, in late 2017, once again, a new detective took the reins on the Linda Slayton investigation. Sergeant Tammy Hathcock, so Detective Hathcock, started delving into the case file, going over everything, trying to establish whether there was anything previous detectives had missed, finding out what evidence they had in the case. And in 2018, Detective Hathcock learned about genetic genealogy, the use of genetic genealogy in criminal cases. I've mentioned this a couple of times before in previous videos, but obviously 2018 was the year when the infamous Golden State Killer case was solved using genetic genealogy, when Joseph DeAngelo was identified as being the serial killer after experts were able to find a distant relative of his in a genealogy database and put together his family tree. So upon learning about this technique, Detective Hathcock wondered if they could use it to advance this case. They had Linda's killer's DNA profile. If they couldn't find an exact match, could they find a partial match somewhere, a familial match on a genealogy website? And so in the summer of 2019, they enlisted the help of renowned genetic genealogist CeCe Moore, who again we've spoken about many times before on this channel. She was kind of a pioneer in the use of this DNA technique, and she's been involved in solving many other homicide cases through her work. So CeCe Moore took the DNA profile and she immediately got to work. She uploaded the profile into a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, which is obviously one of those websites where people can upload their DNA and be matched with potential relatives. And as luck would have it, she got a match. There were people on there who shared the killer's DNA. So using these familial matches as a starting point, she began building the family tree around them, finding ancestors and descendants using all kinds of different records like birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, all that kind of stuff. CeCe described it as like putting together a huge jigsaw puzzle almost, this huge family tree puzzle, until I guess she found that last piece, the last piece being the killer. And it took about 2 whole days, I believe, but eventually she found that missing piece. She was able to narrow down this family tree, the search for the killer, to one individual. It seemed as though there was only one man in this family that the killer could have been. Through the use of genetic genealogy, CeCe Moore was able to tell the detectives that she believed the man who murdered Linda Slayton all those years ago in 1981 was Joseph Clinton Mills. But who was Joseph Clinton Mills? Well, by this point, by 2019, he was 58 years old, meaning that at the time of Linda's murder, he would have only been about 20 years old, or in his early 20s, I think. He lived in an area called Kathleen in Florida at the time of the murder, and he was still living in Kathleen now. In fact, in the exact same house, he'd never moved. And Kathleen is literally only about 8 miles away from Lakeland, so he lived very close by. Seems as though he'd had a successful career. He'd been a truck driver, and also he owned a cleaning business. He had a family. He was married. He had kids, even grandkids by this time. He seemed just like a normal, hardworking family man to all that knew him. However, genetic genealogy now suggested that this nice, normal family man was in fact a cold-blooded murderer. And you'll never guess what the detectives learned when they started delving further into Joseph Mills and his life and his past. They discovered that back in 1981, when Linda Slayton was murdered, Joseph Mills was a football coach. In fact, he was 12-year-old 20-year-old Tim Slayton's football coach. He was the one who ran football practice. He was the coach who would regularly give Linda's son Tim lifts to and from practice, both before and after his mother's murder. And if you recall from earlier on in the video, he gave Tim a ride that fateful night. On the night that Linda was killed, Coach Joe had dropped Tim back to his address just hours before Linda was brutally attacked and murdered. In fact, looking back into the case file, and detectives could actually see that Joseph Mills had been spoken to back in 1981. Police had interviewed him back then. Well, I say interviewed, it seems as though it was more of a very, very brief conversation over the phone. They spoke to him on the phone just the day after Linda died and asked him for a statement. And his statement was that, yeah, he had given 12-year-old Tim a ride home from football practice that night at around 8:30 p.m. And he even told the police that he did briefly speak to Tim's mother, Linda, when he dropped him off. Apparently, when he dropped him off, Linda just asked, you know, how the practice went, how did Tim do? So, yeah, a very, very short conversation was had between them. And then Mills said that he started his car and just went back home. And that was his account, the story that he gave back in 1981. And it appears as though for the police back then, that was enough, that was satisfactory. They didn't really follow up on his account. It's clear that Joseph Mills was never considered a suspect or even a person of interest to investigators back in 1981, which is quite baffling, isn't it, considering that he literally admitted that he had come into contact with the victim just hours before she was killed. The detectives in the original investigation have kind of been heavily criticised for that because, I mean, Joseph Mills was more or less right in front of them the entire time, and yet he was somehow able to slip through the cracks. They didn't even take his prints, his fingerprints or palm prints, to be compared against the palm print that, if you remember, was found on Linda's windowsill, the print left by the killer. Tragically, it's been speculated that racism may have had a part to play in that. Detective Edgar Pickett, the fingerprint expert who collected the killer's palm print from Linda's windowsill, actually claimed in a documentary that I watched about this case that back in 1981, in the immediate aftermath of this case, the majority of palm print samples that were being given to him to compare against the killers were from black men, which he didn't think was a coincidence, considering he himself had been subjected to racism by an officer who was at the crime scene on the day that Linda's body was found. Apparently, whilst Detective Pickett was getting to work trying to find prints at the scene that may have been left behind by the perpetrator, this officer made a comment to him which was something along the lines of, "Oh, you shouldn't be here because a black man has no business seeing the naked body of a white woman." Detective Pickett was literally just doing his job, trying to help solve the murder of a young woman, and he was subjected to vile comments like that whilst he was doing it. It's awful. So yeah, the officers who were involved in the initial investigation were very, very much criticised for their huge error in essentially just ignoring this man who was right in front of them, Joseph Mills, the football coach. Now, upon delving into Joseph Mills's criminal history, they did discover that he had been arrested before, just once. He only had one thing on his rap sheet, I believe. In 1984, just 3 years after Linda's death, he was arrested for grand theft after he apparently forged a will. Now, he didn't serve any jail time for this crime. I'm not sure what his punishment was exactly, but his prints were taken back then. And so upon discovering this in 2019, detectives immediately requested to have these prints that were taken from Mills in 1984. And what do you know? When they obtained them and they were compared against the palm print left on Linda's windowsill, it was a match. Joseph Mills's palm print was a match to the print left behind at the crime scene. The print on the bedroom window, which, as we know, was the killer's point of entry into Linda's house that night. So detectives knew that they were on the right track. They knew that Mills was the killer they had been searching for all these years. But of course, what they really needed to get an arrest warrant was a definitive DNA match. They needed a DNA sample from Mills himself to compare against the killer's killer's DNA profile, the semen evidence from where Linda had been raped. And so they decided to try and get a DNA sample from him secretly, without Mills knowing. Now, they knew that this would be difficult because apparently by 2019, by the time he was 58 years old, he was very much a homebody. He rarely left his house. So they knew that it was unlikely that they would be able to, follow him to a cafe or a restaurant to collect a napkin that he had used or cutlery or something like that, which had his DNA on. And so instead, they decided to collect his trash. They watched his address and secretly collected his trash bags once they had been put out for the garbage truck, and they just began digging through them, looking for anything that might have his DNA. Now, something else that they learned about Joseph Mills was that he had had cancer, and as a result of this, he had to have a colostomy bag. And so when the police started searching through his trash, they were looking for a colostomy bag, which they did find. They did collect a couple of his used colostomy bags, as well as some cotton swabs and some medical adhesive tape that he had used to obviously stick the colostomy bags to him. So they collected all of these items, sent them off to the lab, and scientists were able to extract Mills's DNA from them. And when his DNA was compared against the DNA of Linda's murderer, of course it confirmed what the police already knew. He was the killer. His DNA was an exact match. Finally, after more than 38 years, detectives could inform Linda's family, her two sons who are now both in their 50s, they could inform them that they finally knew the identity of the man who took their mother away from them. And as you can imagine, they were shocked. Tim was utterly and completely shocked to learn that his old football coach, a man that he looked up to and trusted, was the one who stole his mother's life. I mean, this was a man who was almost a role model to Tim as a young teen. In fact, Tim even had a picture of himself with his football coach, Joseph Mills, hung up on his bedroom wall for years after the murder. This picture of Tim and his football team was taken only about a month after Linda was killed, and standing right behind Tim in the photo was Joseph Mills. And yeah, like I said, Tim had this picture on his wall for years because he loved it and he admired his coach so much. So to learn all these years later that Coach Joe, of all people, was the one who did this, it must have been devastating. And what's even more sickening is that Tim said that after his mother's death, that Coach Joe would often ask him questions about the investigation. He would ask like, oh, so what's happening with your mum's case? What's the latest with the investigation? Tim never thought much of this at the time, obviously being so young, but clearly that was Mills trying to find out if the police were close to catching him. Following the DNA match, the police could move in to arrest him, and so that's exactly what they did. On the 12th of December 2019, 58-year-old Joseph Mills was arrested for the 1981 murder of Linda Slayton. Following his arrest, he was taken to the police station where he was questioned by detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley. And initially, it was just complete denial. Again, he admitted that, yeah, he had dropped him back on the night of the 3rd of September after football practice, and he had had a very brief conversation with Linda Slayton, but that was it. He didn't go into her house, he didn't kill her. But of course, the detectives knew that he was lying. They had the DNA, they had his palm print, which proved that he'd gone through Linda's bedroom window, and they had the semen evidence from her rape kit, which was a match to him. And so they confronted Mills with this evidence. They said to him, Joe, we know that you're lying. We've got proof that you did go into her apartment. And it seems as though once Mills was confronted with this evidence, he decided to change his story. He realised that he couldn't keep lying, and so he confessed. Well, not really. He gave a new story in which he admitted that yes, okay, he did go into Linda's apartment that night and he was there when she died, but this wasn't a murder. He didn't murder her, it was an accident. I mean, his new story was essentially victim blaming. He was blaming Linda for what happened that night because he started to claim that when he dropped Tim off after practice and he spoke to Linda, she asked him if he wanted to come back to her apartment later that night for sex, that she would, quote, show him a good time. And so he did. He returned, I think, in the early hours of the 4th of September, and he claimed that when he arrived, Linda literally already had the wire coat hanger around her neck because she wanted them to engage in rough sex. He said that Linda wanted to be tied up and that she wanted him to to tighten the coat hanger around her neck. And yeah, they had sex, and in his version of events, it was all consensual. But it went wrong. Linda died during a sex act gone wrong because the coat hanger was so tight that it strangled her to death. So again, he was essentially blaming her. It was her fault that she died because she wanted him to do these things to her. And afterwards, he just panicked, so he fled the scene. He left Linda's partially nude body on her bed, knowing full well that her 2 teenage sons were sleeping in the same house, knowing that it was more than likely that they would be the ones to find her dead. But of course, as we know, they didn't. Linda's sister Judy did. Now, once again, the police just knew that he was lying. They knew that this new account from Joseph Mills was just a load of crap that he had made up to justify what he had done. Number one, if Linda had invited him to her house that night for sex, then why is he entering the house through her bedroom window and removing the window screen? Surely he would just go to the front door and she would let him in. Number two, this coat hanger was so incredibly deep into her neck. I mean, you can see from this picture just how small the gap was, how tight it must have been around her throat. There's no way that she could have consented to that. And number three, if you recall from earlier, Linda had a load of scratch marks to her neck from where she had clearly tried desperately hard to pull this coat hanger off of her. How could it have been consensual if she had these marks? Nothing about his new story made sense, and using the evidence, the police were able to theorize what they believed really happened that night. So they theorized that after dropping Tim back home at around 8:30 p.m, that was when Joseph Mills made the decision to break into Linda's apartment whilst everyone was out of the house. It's likely that Linda mentioned to Mills that she and Tim were headed to their neighbours that evening for a party and that Jeff was at his grandparents, and so Mills thought that this was the perfect opportunity. And so later that night, he returned to her apartment whilst no one was home. He made his way inside of Linda's bedroom through the unlocked open window. He removed the window screen, crawled inside, and then the police think that he just waited for Linda to eventually return home because he intended to rape her. It's believed actually that he probably hid inside of Linda's closet in her bedroom, and that was when he decided that he was going to use a wire coat hanger during the attack. And when Linda eventually returned home and she went to bed, that was when he jumped out of the closet and he raped and murdered her. And then again, he just left her dead body on the bed before fleeing the scene. And I mean, clearly, as time passed by, as the years and decades passed with the case remaining unsolved, he clearly thought that he'd gotten away with this crime. He really had gotten away with murder. He could go to his grave without anyone finding out what he did. He could live a normal, happy life with no one knowing that he was a cold-blooded killer. But thank God he was incorrect. Thank God his luck ran out eventually. It's just a shame that he did get those 38 years of freedom. He was able to remain a free man after killing Linda Slayton for longer than Linda had even been on this earth. Shortly after his arrest, detectives charged Joseph Mills with burglary, sexual battery, and also first-degree murder. And despite essentially trying to use the rough sex defense during his police interview, when it came to his plea hearing, he entered a plea of guilty. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges. He obviously knew that the evidence against him was overwhelming. There was no way a jury would think that he was innocent, so what was the point in going to trial? And so because of his guilty plea, he just had to be sentenced. And at his sentencing in February of 2022, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, Linda's family members, including her sister Judy and her 2 sons Jeff and Tim, gave heartbreaking victim impact statements, even confronting Mills, asking him directly in court why he had to take their mum away from them. But being the coward that he is, Joseph Mills said nothing in response. He wouldn't give Linda's sons the answers that they wanted. But at the very, very least, they had peace of mind knowing that finally, after 4 decades, their mother had gotten the justice that she deserved. They had peace of mind knowing that her killer was going to remain behind bars until he died. And that is it for this case. That concludes the heartbreaking case of Linda Slayton. My heart really goes out to Linda's loved ones, her 2 sons in particular. They were way too young to have lost their mum, and in such a brutal way. And you can really see from interviews that they've done just how much this horrific horrific crime tortures them still to this day. To have to think about what their mum went through that night, the pain and sheer terror is incomprehensible. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments down below, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is linked in the description box. A quick thank you once again to June's Journey for partnering with me on today's video. And as promised, I shall now reveal to you the hidden object from this murder scene. The answer to the riddle was footprint, which can be seen near the bottom of this picture. Let me know in the comments if you managed to solve the riddle yourself. Again, you can click the link in the description box or scan the QR code that is on the screen right now to download the game for free. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.